In the 1970s, Marvel tried to break into the Japanese market, but despite them using their most popular character, Spider-Man, it was unsuccessful. It wouldn't be until the late 1970s when Spider-Man would get his redemption in the form of a live-action children's TV series. This is in large part due to Gene Pelc, the man whose determination to see Marvel and Spider-Man succeed in Japan would not only change Marvel's fortunes, but Toei's as well. In this part, we'll be diving deeper into Gene's career and how it would impact not only Tokusatsu, but comic books and animation as well.
I talked them into trying Japan because I had the connections here and I saw the work that they could do. So I said, look, as long as we have to redo the stories, let's kind of go with the Japanese format.
Now this is a great idea because now you have a way to tell the story to kids and adults so that they can understand and relate to it better because they can culturally identify with it.
And Spider-Man, though, as you'll notice if you look at it, has the same powers that the original Spider-Man has. He has the same costume. So basically, we rewrote the stories. There's no Aunt May, there's no Uncle Ben, and Peter Parker became Yamashiro Takuya. And instead of being the reporter that Peter Parker was, he was a motorcycle enthusiast. They use a whole different background. And there's Marveler, which is the basic robot, and there's Leopardon that it changes into. We had to make the stories something that the Japanese audience would love. And the first thing that kind of was a shocker was the Japanese sponsor.
Once that deal was secured between Toei and Marvel, that also came with Bandai, because Bandai was not only just making the toys for the Tokusatsu shows, but the animation shows that Toei was producing as well. So they had a great deal of say as to what went into these shows because they were going to be the ones selling the toys.
They wanted a robot in the show, and the reason was at that time one of the most popular toys in Japan were these die-cast metal robots. Now that obviously has nothing to do with Spider-Man, but it has everything to do with it because Bandai was going to be the sponsor. And without a sponsor, there was no money to put us on TV. They wanted a robot, so to me that was a darn good reason for a robot. How do we get it into the show? And then we start using the creative writers and creative people of Toei, come up with a storyline that would have a robot and that would make sense in it.
It almost seemed like an experiment that they were trying out, but it's something that ended up making a lot of sense because once Spider-Man could no longer handle the villain of the week anymore on a normal human scale because they would grow to this enormous size, he would then have to pilot the Marveler to then transform it into Leopardon to fight these monsters on a level playing field.
We made a pilot of the first Spider-Man, which had, you know, the robots and all the things in it. And then we're sitting in a screening room in Tokyo. Stan had come over with a bunch of the Cadence business people, and we're sitting in the room, and I'm sitting there saying to myself, God, I hope they love this stuff, because if not, I'm finished, I'm out of here. I got nowhere to go, so I'm sitting there scared to death. We play the whole first half hour, and the business people, dead quiet, not a word was said. I'm sitting there going, oh my God, this is going nowhere. And they're just looking at it saying, Gene, what's wrong with you? You've been in Japan too long. This has nothing to do with Spider-Man. What is this that we're seeing? This is dumb, except for one guy. One guy stood up applauding, and that was Stan Lee, who said, this is great.
Oh, that's great.
He said, this is a living comic book. This is fantastic. Let's go with it. So when he said that, the business people all looked at me and said, Gene, what a great idea. Let's go with this.
And I don't know if Gene and Toei realized that they had just created what was to become one of the most iconic and long-lasting tropes in Tokusatsu history, but I'm pretty sure they learned very quickly that they were onto something good when they got the sales figures back for the Japanese Spider-Man merchandise, because they used the trope again in their next co-production, which was Battle Fever J.
So yes, a lot of the stuff in all the Japanese shows at the time, you could say they were a commercial for the toys. And I have to say, yes, that's true, they were. put a lot of the stuff in because it was a commercial. And this was why it became so successful. Every kid had to have one of these things. They had to have a Marveler, they had to have a Leopardon, they had to have a Spider-Man, they had to have all these things. And there's actually a GP7 if you look at that. And here's an inside story. What do you think GP stands for? Everybody says Grand Prix. My name is Gene Pelc, and as a radio disc jockey, I used to sign off every day with GP, stay loose. And I used to hang out after work with all the creative guys, and we'd have a few beers and laugh and stuff. And I say, hey, why don't you call it GP, not Grand Prix, Gene Pelc? So GP7 became that, which is a little something that Paul Harvey would say is the rest of the story. And the show became extremely popular. And after Spider-Man finished, we went on to do different things, and I started finding it was easier to create Japanese stories than to just change over American stories. And the next story that happened, I believe, in time sequence was Battle Fever J, a story based loosely on the Avengers. And then following that, it was DenjiMan.
And the last series would be some Vulcan of these Marvel and Toei co-produced Tokusatsu shows. But this would be the third series of what was now considered to be the Super Sentai series at the time. Some of the other benefits of the licensing deal between Toei and Marvel that Gene had established extended into comics. Because of Bandai being attached to Toei, that's the reason why Gene was able to secure license for what we came to know here in America as Shogun Warriors, which were mecha from various tokusatsu and anime shows around that time. This is crucial because Shogun Warriors would really lay the foundation for the Transformers to build off of a couple years later. While I was in Gene's home, there was a bunch of old documents that he showed me somewhere between the ages of 30 and 40 years old. This one here on the left is actually a really old one. You can see here in the upper right-hand corner of it, it says Marvel Comics Group, a division of Cadence Industries Corporation, has Spider-Man on the left side there and who the contact was for this particular document. And it talks about the Shogun Warriors and Marvel Comics, not only them licensing Shogun Warriors, but kind of outlining their intent to make Shogun Warriors a monthly title for Marvel Comics, and just kind of giving an overall plot summary of how that would go. Now, independent of the deal with Toei, Gene was able to make yet another mark in Marvel Comics history when he pitched them on this idea to go ahead and make a comic book based on the life of historical religious figure St. Francis of Assisi. Now, this came after the idea had been pitched to him by a gentleman by the name of Father Campion Lally, who was a part of the Franciscan Chapel Center in Tokyo, Japan. And not long after that, he was also able to convince Marvel, and by he I mean Gene, to make a comic book based on the life of Pope John Paul II. This came after he had had a discussion with a gentleman by the name of Father Malinsky, and these sold very well, and even a third comic book came out after that based on the life of Mother Teresa. Although Gene was not really directly involved in that one, this was really the only time in the history of Marvel Comics that they did such a thing, that they based comic books on the life of historical religious figures. And I believe to this day they haven't done that since. And this document on the right, as you can see, is the news document. It says release date July 2nd, 1980. Marvel Entertainment Group forms Marvel Productions Ltd, a television, motion picture, and animation studio, Sherman Oaks, California. So this was them talking about their more popular characters at the time, which was like Spider-Man, Hulk, Captain America, and their intent to try to break into the television and feature film industry. And James Galton had seen that, the time was right for Marvel, and of course we had already seen it happen in Japan with Gene, but Gene, Stan, and Mr. Galton saw that the future for Marvel seemed to be shifting more towards television, even though at this time they had already produced the Incredible Hulk TV show, which was very successful for them. The Spider-Man TV show had already come out as well, although it wasn't as well received.
I think you need a little help.
Now, at that time, Stan Lee had moved from New York to California because he, being the visionary he said, people are going to stop reading, they're going to start getting into TV, and he wanted to get into TV. And Marvel had so many great characters.
One of our really good licensees when we had the Patty Freeling was Marvel Comics. And we did Spider-Woman and the Fantastic Four, and we licensed the properties from Marvel.
So Cadence, which was the company that owned Marvel at the time, decided to buy into the animation world, which was in California. So they bought the DePatie Freleng studio, known for their work on Pink Panther.
I got a call from the president of Marvel, come on in to New York and see me. And I did. He said, would you be interested in setting up a new production company for us? We don't want to license things anymore. We want to own the whole enchilada. And we want to go into the production business. So I thought about it, and I sure liked Stan Lee. He and I got along famously, and I accepted the position, and I became the first president and CEO of Marvel Productions.
And David DePatie became the president, and then there were some other people there who took over the running of the studio, which was in Sherman Oaks, LA.
Outside of Tokusatsu, the deal between Marvel and Toei that Gene established also helped in the animation realm. A lot of the shows that were seen that became very big hits in the 1980s were a direct result of the Marvel and Toei partnership. Shows like G.I. Joe, Transformers, My Little Pony, just to name a few. And if you were to actually look at the credits for each of those respective shows' animated feature films, you would see Gene's name in the credits.
They would sell the show in America and come up with the characters and do the storyboards in America. From that point, I would take the storyboards and have them produced in Japan. All camera work was done here, all backgrounds, all cell work was created in Japan. And then bring the films back in America for post-production, where they would cut in the music and the voices. During this period, I started thinking to myself, you know, if we took those live action films we made and we reshoot them, I said, here's a great opportunity. We have this, we own all this stuff like Vulcan, DenjiMan, Battle Fever J. We own all this stuff. And here is basically a great show. What do you have to do to make this work in America? Reshoot the studio scenes. Just take out the Japanese actors when you see their faces and put in American actors. We keep all the CG work. We keep all the explosions. We keep all of the stunt work. I said that's 2/3 of the budget right there. We could replace the studio shots with stuff done in America at 1/3 of the price, and so 1/3 of the price, you've got a full half hour.
So this right here is the Comics Interview magazine from March of 1983. And if we go to pages 54 and 55, we can see here, this is the interview with Gene. And the part we really need to turn our attention to in this article is this part that says right here, the latest one called Vulcan is technically our best product. We did 52 episodes. I just talked to Stan Lee about a half hour ago, and he is so in love with the program. He said that in all his experience of writing for people, if they could see the show in America on a Saturday morning, it would wipe out anything because it's full of action and is very entertaining. He is trying to sell it to an American network, HBO, anyone who buys films. He can sell it as is with a new voice track, or take the prints and cut out the parts where Japanese actors appear, which is about 1/3 of the film, reshoot that with American actors and cut back to the show with special effects and opticals and visuals, thus creating a series that looks American.
And so I made a pilot film like that, in which we had basically used American actors and voices and stuff. And I remember very well to this day in Sherman Oaks, I had brought over a pilot and I had all the powers that be, which was Stan, David DePatie, Margaret Lesh, who was our liaison to the TV companies at the time, and a guy by the name of Saban, who was producing music for all our Saturday morning cartoons.
Well, around this time, Saban was making the rounds to all the different animation studios, where he was pitching them this idea that he would go ahead and do the theme songs for a lot of these cartoons that they were producing for free, under the condition that he would retain the publishing rights for those songs. Now, this wasn't limited to just the American releases of these cartoons. It was also for the releases abroad, like in places like Europe.
And they came up with a series. They changed, they went with my ideas. They changed the actors into American actors. So you'd have basically California-style actors replacing, and everything that was in costume and the stunt work and CG we used from Dupneg. And Fox bought it and they called it the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And as you know, it enjoyed a little bit of popularity after that.
Now this is Power Rangers the ultimate visual history. And there's a part in here that I think is pretty interesting that I'm going to go over that's actually on page 10 that says this. Saban's idea for bringing the Japanese series to American audiences was not to reshoot it entirely, but to use select footage from its episodes. The Japanese actors wore helmets that completely masked their faces, plus the monsters and aliens they fought were played by unseen actors or stunt people in costumes. Saban realized he could repurpose the scenes of the heroes performing martial arts-based combat and the monster sequences, plus use any other scenes that didn't feature notable Japanese locations or background actors. Scenes featuring the actors fighting without their helmets could be shot anew, and new material would be written for the American production's actors. Each show's plot would be newly created by a team of writers, but would need to connect up with the original Japanese show's fight scenes. When Haim Saban is asked about how he came up with the idea for Power Rangers, he always cites this story of going to Japan in 1984 on a business trip, and while he's there in his Tokyo hotel room, turns on the TV set, and there he sees it for the very first time, Super Sentai, specifically Bioman. And he's immediately captivated by these young people that transform into these colorful spandex-wearing superheroes that kick monster butt.
Yeah, 1984, I was laying on my bed in a hotel in Tokyo, flipping through the 3 channels, and all of a sudden, these 5 kids in spandex appeared and kicking monsters that came to Earth to eat all the food on Earth. And I thought, that sounds like an intelligent show, and I'd like to... I can't explain why, but I fell in love with it. It's That's just great. From my gut, my kishke, it just really just grabbed me.
And then it dawns on him. He knows exactly how he can adapt this series for an American audience. What's interesting about this, though, is his plan is nearly identical to the plan that Gene laid out a year prior in the Comics Interview magazine article. It is within the realm of possibility that both these men could have had the same exact idea. It could just be coincidence. Now, I can't say as a matter of fact that Haim knew about Super Sentai prior to 1984, but I think that you can speculate, and I think that there is some compelling evidence to suggest, at least in the possibility, that he could have known about it prior to 1984. When we look at the Comics Interview magazine, which of course predates his trip, that's one good piece of evidence, I think. And another interesting one is the fact that he did have a relationship with the Patty Free League Studios because he had already done music for them for their international markets. Now, one such example of this was when Haim Saban and his associates Shuki Levy and Noam Kanyel did an Italian theme song for the Patty Free League Studios produced Spider-Woman cartoon, which of course was a Marvel property. So I imagine that Haim Saban probably spent a lot of time at the Patty Free League Studios because he did a lot of different theme songs from, not necessarily in English. We also hear that Margaret Lash believes that she had met Haim in the early 1980s. She's pretty confident in that she met him in the early 1980s.
So when I first met Haim, I think I was at Marvel Productions in the 1980s. And Haim had come to town from France, and he had a company that was known for music, doing music for animation, for music. And that's what he did in Paris. He did a lot of the music. His partner, Shuki Levy, was a singer and a composer, and Haim and he had a band together. And the story that Haim would tell is that he wasn't a very good bass player, so he decided to become their manager. And he did so successfully in Europe. So when he came to LA, his goal was to do music for animated series. And he contacted all the heads of all the studios, and thus he got in touch with me. And I could have even been at Hanna-Barbera. It could have been in the late 70s, but I recall it was the early 80s.
At the very least, by the time that she was taking over as the head of Marvel Productions, which, as we all know, was formerly known as the Patty Free League Studios.
Unfortunately, at that point, I got cut out of it. Stan got cut out of it. He had been trying but did not succeed in making the sale. Margaret Lesh made the sale, along with Haim Saban. to be the producer. And Power Rangers became what it became.
I'm of the personal belief that Power Rangers as we know it today exists because of Gene coming up with the concept of how to adapt the Super Sentai series for an American audience.
At that point, I decided to go to work for myself. I left Marvel and started running my own company in Japan.
At this point, Gene wanted to take a break from the interviews, so we went ahead and just wrapped it up. We did continue our conversation after the camera went off, and he did tell me of what he did after Marvel, and it was very interesting stuff. One of the things that he went on to do was co-promote events with UWF International, which was a Japanese shoot wrestling organization that would heavily influence the actual sport of mixed martial arts.
Well, shoot wrestling is one of the oldest new sports around. This dates back to the ancient Greeks, Romans, the Spartan warriors, who put on something called the Pancratium Games. They combine the meanest, most realistic elements of jiu-jitsu, boxing, kickboxing, and submission wrestling into the toughest fighting style in the world. You win or lose a fight by a knockout, or by giving up before something gets broken. You can punch, slap, kick, knee, wrestle, almost anything goes as long as it works. Now, some people call this street fighting. If so, it's the most highly developed form of street fighting you've ever seen. We prefer to think of it as the newest, toughest form of hand-to-hand combat around.
Anytime, any place you want it, I'll take you on any where.
Another thing that he would end up doing, and still does to this day actually, was go back to his merchandising roots. He was doing music venue merchandising, which was not all that common. He was one of the people kind of pioneering that, being a foreigner, because that was usually left up to Japanese promoters to do. So he got to do that for bands such as Duran Duran, Aerosmith, and to this day, even with artists of today like Avril Lavigne, he's been able to do musical venue merchandising and still does that. And he showed me just this time capsule of stuff. There was toys, Japanese Spider-Man toys. There was all sorts of books and other memorabilia. And probably the coolest thing that he showed me was one of the Japanese Spider-Man suits that was actually used on the Japanese Spider-Man series. That completely blew my mind. Gene showed me a lot of old documents as well, but the one thing that really stuck out to me, that was probably the most fascinating thing that he showed me, was a photo album. And in this photo album, he had pictures of himself and Stan with various Toei executives at the time. And one of the cooler pictures that he showed me in there that I'm pretty sure that nobody has seen unless they've actually been to his house and he himself has personally shown them this picture, was a picture of Stan Lee and Shotaro Ishinomori. So let me lay out a purely hypothetical scenario. And it's not to say that things wouldn't have still gotten to this point, but let's say that Gene goes to Japan and is unable to reach an agreement with Toei. So that means Marvel and Toei don't have a relationship and there's no Japanese Spider-Man series. Because of there not being this Tokusatsu series, we don't see the giant robot trope. We don't have the co-produced Super Sentai shows between Marvel and Toei either. And we don't know how Japanese Tokusatsu is affected from that point on. It's not to say that they wouldn't have ended up including the giant robot somewhere down the line. Maybe they would have, but it wouldn't have happened when it did. It might have been a lot later. So it's fair to argue, who knows if Power Rangers would have come from that down the line. We also look at the animation deal that Toei and Marvel had. A lot of the shows that 80s kids and some 90s kids enjoyed that ended up becoming pop cultural icons were a direct result of the Toei and Marvel deal. Without that, who knows if we get G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero, or Transformers, or My Little Pony, or countless others. So that changes. Then, these comic books that are now a part of history, the only Marvel comic books based on religious historical figures, who knows if we get those, right? Because if Gene doesn't make this deal between Marvel and Toei, what reason does he have to still stay in Japan? Maybe he leaves Japan and comes back to New York and does other things. So the whole point with making this video was really to just showcase this man that has made some very unique accomplishments and had an impact that goes mostly unnoticed by people. And the hope is that now, whoever is watching this video will try to find more people like Gene who are unsung heroes and whose stories need to be told.